if you educate crows, they come back and peck your eyes out. And this is essentially what the United States did. They trained an entire pool of crows, and one of these crows was named Luis Posada Carriles. He seemed to be, how shall I say it, a more determined crow than the others. I mean, he's on it. He's, I think, almost 80 years old now. And I keep telling people that he heads an organization called GAS, which is the Geezers Assassination Society. Posada Carriles, in between visits to his proctologist, plots assassinations, along with his other friend, Orlando Bosch. They go to their gerontologist, they cash their Social Security checks, and then they plot terrorism. And they do so in Miami, Florida. And they do so with the support of a whole bunch of other crows that live around them. This is a culture of crows. And these people were all essentially taken in. It started under Eisenhower. This is when the plan began. The idea was the United States does not tolerate disobedience in this hemisphere. It had proven that in the past many times. Every time a Latin American president would try to demonstrate independence, well, we had an era called gunboat diplomacy. A gunboat would move down there, fire a few shells into the capital city, the president would leave, and the United States would install a new president. Later it became dollar diplomacy, where you could buy them out. Later it became good neighbor diplomacy, and one of our best neighbors was a man named Somoza of Nicaragua, and another good neighbor of ours was Fulgencio Batista. Venezuela, of course, had its own dictator, as did Colombia. So there was a whole host of, how should I say it, American lackeys who were dictators, but the policy was the same. Anybody who disobeys gets punished. In 1954, the Guatemalan people elected Jacobo Arbenz as president. It was a free, fair, democratic election. Arbenz planned to make certain reforms. These reforms didn't sit well with certain American corporations, especially the United Fruit Company. Many of the major stockholders just happened to hold cabinet posts in the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower declared that such an act was equivalent of communism, and the CIA led a successful plot to overthrow him. So there's nothing new in this. The question is the method. Now, in Cuba, this was the method. You train and educate a pool of crows, several thousand of them, send them back to Cuba to invade the country, and everything should fall as it did in Guatemala, only it didn't in Cuba. The Cubans resisted successfully, and the United States has felt absolutely wounded by the audacity of the Cubans to resist an invasion of the United States. And this has burned in the, how should I say it? I can't say soul. It has burned in the heart of the national security elite for almost 50 years.
Billy.
This is Saul Landau from the Institute for Policy Studies. Saul, in the piece you wrote about Posada, you do focus a great deal on both Posada and the other fellow that both of you have mentioned, Bosch. But as an example of the crows coming back to bite you in the eye, you point out that in 1973, Bosch plotted to assassinate Henry Kissinger for signing an anti-hijacking treaty with Cuba, and he staged 2 bombings while offering $3 million to the person who would assassinate Castro. Could you tell us about that?
Well, Kissinger was a traitor, according to Orlando Bosch. He had negotiated a treaty with the hated Fidel Castro. Remember, I said before that the hijackings began in December 1958, and they continued afterwards. Every so often, a Cuban would grab a plane in Cuba and fly it to Florida, where he was welcomed as a hero, and the planes were not even returned. In the late 1960s, hijacking started going the other way. Armed Americans would pull a gun on an airplane and fly the plane to Cuba, or have the pilot fly the plane to Cuba. Now, ironically, the Cubans arrested all of the people who arrived